let's kick off our opening keynote. The potential of artificial intelligence as an opportunity and a disruptive force is enormous for the journalism community. These technologies have already started to transform our business and how we work. This discussion examines all that AI offers in this pivotal moment in our world and how journalism plays a key part now and in the future. Joining us today will be Liz Danzico, Vice President of Design at Microsoft, Dalia Hashim, the AI and Media Integrity Research and Program Lead at Partnership on AI, and Matt Masterson, Director of Information Integrity at Microsoft. Moderating will be longtime member, friend, ally, and accomplice of O&A, Paul Cheung, CEO for the Center of Integrity. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome to the O&A stage.
Good morning, everyone. Let's give another big round of applause for David, Lashara, and the staff of O&A for putting together the amazing conference. So let's talk about AI. And so today's conversation, we're going to focus about the current state of AI. We're going to go a little bit about what we learned from our previous dance with technology and how AI could be different, followed by what does it mean for us as journalists and the journalism at large. And then finally, we're going to talk about how do you ground AI. But before we go into these deep discussions, I want to do some rapid fire questions. And these are the questions for the Trekkies and the Marvel fans. So which system is closer to reality and why? Iron Man's Jarvis or Star Trek computer AI?
I'm the wrong one to start. I confessed to Paul before the panel that I'm not a Trekkie, and so I know. Please don't jump, but I love Marvel. So I actually asked Bing Chat for a response on this just to see what it might say, and it only distinguished the two. So I'm going to say Star Trek just because of the response from Bing Chat differentiating it from Jarvis and what Jarvis is now. So I don't have a good answer on that one.
Yeah. What about you, Liz?
So I have to say, in our household growing up, we had to choose between Doctor Who and Star Trek. But so even nonetheless, I also would say Jarvis. I think that even though we're sort of saying Siri, hey Google at the moment, and not hey computer, like Jarvis did, I think we're not that far away. That kind of reality is just around the corner, and it feels quite similar to the way that we are experiencing AI today, meaning things feel very much around the corner, right? And so Jarvis feels more prescient.
Okay, so Dalia, you're the tiebreaker. There's one Star Trek, one Jarvis.
I think I'm going to have to go with Jarvis on this one.
Oh.
Yeah, I think to Liz's point, Jarvis is a lot more of a personal assistant. It helps Iron Man do what he needs to do. Computer AI is more of a critical thinker, and I would say AI is not a critical thinker at the moment. So yeah, Jarvis definitely.
Thank you. So second question, which system is more dangerous? Skynet from the Terminator or the Matrix?
So this one I did have an opinion on, and I say, as someone that works in information integrity around mis and disinformation, I say the Matrix. The ability to manipulate reality and basically control humans in that way and change in a virtual reality way the way that humans perceive their own existence, I take as a more dangerous threat in this environment, particularly in the line of work that I do.
I don't want to. I would like to not agree with Matt actually, but we disagreed.
That's common
many times.
for me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know. Just earlier today we disagreed, but I have to agree. As a person who makes a business in understanding human behavior and using that to kind of translate, I think the most dangerous thing is to sort of mask human behavior or sort of deceive and be deceptive. So the Matrix, I think, did that. So. A vote for the Matrix.
Yeah. Paul, I have to thank you. You launched me and my colleague Christian into like a 15-minute discussion on this question when I was trying to get his take. Because, to your points, do we want to know when we're about to die or do we not? My vote was I would like to know. I would like to go into it eyes wide open. So my vote was for Skynet. But I totally see the argument for the Matrix. So.
Okay, and my final rapid fire question is, if anyone remember that movie AI with Julie Osmond, right? So, who would you rather be friends with in terms of an AI humanoid? Star Trek's Data or Blade Runner's Rachel?
So I chose Data. I think Data has a more human side, for lack of a better term, even though he's AI in his own way, and has an ability to connect, or at least eventually developed some sort of ability to connect. And so I chose Data. He seems like he'd be a great friend and very helpful.
He's really good at chess.
Yeah.
Sure. I agree. I chose Data too. Mostly for the cuteness factor, not gonna lie. So.
Yeah, I also chose Data because of the rule following and just this idea of like having someone who always knows where the sort of moral compass is and the moral center. But I have to say, I want to convince Rachel, and sort of like be able to kind of bring Rachel to the other side. So there's a case for like the sort of aspirational friend in Rachel.
Well, all jokes aside, in terms of these questions, one of the since generative AI have come on the scene late last year, there have been a lot of imaginations and a lot of chatter about what AI can and cannot do. So first of all, AI is nothing new, right? And so what about AI right now, particularly generative AI, have really sparked these widespread discussions across industry? And what are some of the reasons why it's driving it to its current prominence right now?
I would probably say generative AI did what a lot of technologies before it in AI were not able to do, in the sense that it was able to show, not tell. All of a sudden, everyone had access to that technology. They could play around with it. They could test it for themselves. They could see its own capabilities for themselves. So you have people coming back and being like, well, this is the closest I've ever seen to magic. So, I've tried it for myself, and I know what it's like. No one is telling me that it can do all of these different things. And so I think that kind of led to a lot of its widespread. And just to give you folks an example, last year was my first ONA, and it was wonderful. Woohoo! And I remember like talking to a lot of people here, and they were like, "What do you do?" And I'm like, "I work in responsible AI." And they were like, "That's really cool, but like also, why are you here?" Not in like an aggressive way, but like in a like very inquisitive, like how does this relate to journalism? And this year, here we are, talking about AI in the opening panel. And so I think all of that change in 1 year is just anecdotal to how much AI has kind of become ubiquitous in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, I think a few things. One, AI, Gen AI, and sort of like I agree, it's been sort of around for a long time, but Gen AI, as we know it today, seems to pass the Turing test. It's sort of more indistinguishable from what we can sort of recognize as human-created content, and that is enticing in many ways and risky in other ways. And I think it's sort of access is also intriguing, and I think the sort of low barrier to entry has both its positive and negative, but I think its access and ubiquity and its speed has been quite intoxicating, and leaves room for the human to kind of strategize, create, be creative, and kind of accelerated innovation and growth in ways that we hadn't seen before. And then the fluency, if you think about, very, very early on, and the fluency that was needed to create a simple web page, right? And the fluency was needed with brackets and code and, all the things, JavaScript, and all these words and language that we needed to teach people, and it was hidden behind things, right? In order to get the interface to show up. The code, the prompt engineering that we'll perhaps talk about later, is right here, right? It's sort of accessible to us. It feels very plain language. So those are some of the sort of, I think, three kind of aspects that are at play right now.
Not much to add beyond what they've said, except for the sort of practicality that it's presented for many. I think of the conversation that I had with my wife as I was working on these projects, and it came home to her. Her least favorite task throughout the week is meal planning for the week, and her ability. I kind of walked her through. Let's talk about what kind of ingredients we have. Let's see, and within 10 minutes, we had a meal plan, an ingredients list, and a cost list from the local grocery stores, and that practicality for her was attractive around a task that otherwise is frustrating and sort of tedious. And so I think folks have seen the opportunity to eliminate some tedium. Is that a word? We'll say it is. Eliminate tedious tasks and really engage to improve and gain back perhaps their most valuable resource, which is time around some of this. So.
And question about sort of the development of the technology. How fast is it in terms of evolving from sort of like, a couple of years ago when we think about AI, we use like algorithm, right? And then machine learning, and now it's generative. And what is the next big thing like beyond generative? Like how fast is this technology actually evolving?
That's a good question. I feel like we're already at the next thing. I mean, if we talk about the next thing, we were, looking at, web pages. We looked at social, we looked at mobile, we looked at sort of the cloud. We had these many sort of touch points, and now I think we're at this moment of generative AI, but yet all along we were looking at AI. How fast is a great question. I mean, it's at the intersection of how fast technology is developing and how quickly humans are ready for it and so the question is only partially worth answering with all due respect, because it doesn't matter unless sort of the culture and society is sort of ready to accept it as well. That's my thought. So I don't know if we're sort of almost ready for what's next after generative AI, because we're still sort of processing where its place is and what's next for it.
I would probably say that, like, as far as AI development in the way that we see it, in like a regular, touchable, impactful way, I don't think we're going to experience as big of a leap similar to generative AI in like the immediate near future. But I think what we build on top of the pre-existing technologies is going to be very interesting. And I think, like, anecdotally, the first couple of months after ChatGPT came out, the amount of software that was being built on top of that technology was amazing to see. Like, it was insane how many different websites, how many different products popped up so quickly after it was made available to the public. And I think that trend is only going to grow. I think for AI itself, there's still like a lot of questions that we're still puzzling with. How do you create so much data to feed such like large algorithms? How do you power such large algorithms with all of the environmental impact that they have and all of these side effects? So like that's, I think, a question that we're still very much so struggling to solve. So I don't necessarily think that we're going to see a major leap in the next year or two, but I do think that the products that are being created on top of these technologies are wild to watch. At least that's my take.
So that's encouraging. It means that we have a little bit of time to catch up right? And so when we think about, in this generative AI, who are some of the biggest winners and losers you think that, whether it's journalism or other sectors, who are some of the winners and losers? Is it technology companies going to continue to win? Retailers, are they the losers?
Go ahead.
I think that's yet to be determined, right? I think there's so much to play out as far as the uses, the investment. Certainly, as someone that's at a tech company, in order to sort of be on the winning side, as the question's framed, it's incumbent on us to continue to engage with the communities that are trying this technology. That's why we're here today, having these conversations, because we can't meaningfully impact the world in the way that Microsoft attempts to do without engagement, conversation, skepticism, criticism from the communities that it's intended to support. I think we've seen early on that those who have at least begun to use or experiment with or engage with the technology have found value and begun to see the efficiencies that can be brought. We've seen, we have a partner that's actually here now named Noda, that's working with journalists actively to increase the reach that newsrooms have into their communities, the engagement with content and things like that. I think as we continue to see that engagement, it'll flesh itself out. But winners, I don't think we're at a point of determining winners or losers. I think we're at a point of trying to bring everyone together and have that meaningful conversation about timing, pace, and what's appropriate to support the various communities, whether it's journalism, medicine. Certainly the conversation in government is an interesting one as well.
Yeah. I was listening to the NPR One app this morning. Shout out to the NPR One app, and I was listening to a story about how India reached, was launched into space, and the woman who was being interviewed used the pronoun we. We reached. I'm sort of misquoting to a room full of journalists, but use the pronoun we to communicate that we've reached, we've done this. And the question was, when you say we, is this about, are you referring to the country, or are you referring to us as a planet, right? And so the conversation was about, this is an achievement for all of us. And I think to your question, that's what we are doing right now. The opportunity, the winners, the losers, are not the tech companies or the citizens or the consumers or the journalists. We are not all in this together, because clearly people have different advantages and disadvantages across communities. And so I'm not saying everyone is equal by any means. However, we are at a moment where the opportunity is so great. And we're standing at this precipice of, where we had those touch points, right? From web to social to mobile to the cloud, et cetera. And this is another precipice. And so what opportunity do we have in front of us, and what are we going to do with it? What are we going to do with it is the question. In a world of increasing complexity, with economic disparity, with, people being laid off from Twitter and not being able to post things to their account, how are we going to use this opportunity to sort of unpack and untangle? And I would hope that the opportunity is that we think of it as we, both in the wins and the losses, and we sort of create this partnership and foster trust.
I agree. I think that a lot of it is still to be seen as far as winners and losers. But if I were to kind of look into the tea leaves and say, who I think might be winners and losers, I think everyone kind of wins from the accessibility and the ability to kind of do things faster, more efficiently, all of that across the board. So I think that that's a great thing to kind of look forward to. On the flip side, I think it can, if misused, hurt, we're talking about journalism primarily, hurt a journalist's most important asset, and that's their credibility and the trust that they are building with their audience. And so I think when we talk about the winning and losing aspects of using some of this technology, I think we need to kind of look at, all of the promises that it has, but also realize that when misused or when not appropriately governed, the consequences can also be equally as intense. And I think, by far, if I was to say who loses the most or who is in a position to lose the most, I'd probably say the consumer, the individual. Mostly because I think in a lot of these instances, we have passed on the responsibility to discern truth from falsehood or to use a technology appropriately or to be able to read what is, a deep fake from what is not to the individual. So now they have to not only be technologically aware, they have to continually make some of those split-second decisions about what they believe and what they don't on a fairly regular basis. And so I kind of wonder if we've set up ourselves as individuals, and our communities at large for success to be able to make some of those decisions.
Yeah, because I think there is a shift in burden where it goes from the people who are creating the product to the people who are consuming the product. Matt, you were talking about, it's about collaborating, there's no determination of winners and losers yet, but yet I keep wondering, because journalism's collaboration with technology partners is not our first rodeo, right? We've done it with Web 1 and Web 2, and time again, to be frank, many of us feel like we've been burned by technology companies and technology partners who want to collaborate. So what is our reason to collaborate with you and really trust you this time around? We've been on many dates, but we get flowers, some investment, and fancy dinner, but they don't really last.
Yeah.
So what will be different this time around?
Yeah, that's not the first time I've heard that complaint, unfortunately. It's for me on dates. No, it's a really fair question, and the answer is one that there shouldn't be an expectation that you just trust us. What needs to happen, and just speaking for Microsoft, can't speak for obviously the other tech companies. The engagement, the work that we're trying to do, we released, for those that haven't seen, a guidebook for local news yesterday that we have at the table and available online. That's our attempt to get out in the community and really understand the challenges, economic, operationally, security-wise, right? The threats that journalists are facing, and really engage in a meaningful way out in the community, so that the trust isn't just about, I bought you flowers or a nice box of chocolates, but in fact, trying to be out in the environment that you operate in, meet you where you are and understand the needs, so that then the tech can be responsive to those needs. So that information, I think you'll see reflected in the guidebook, a understanding from our experiences with those pilot newsrooms, the very real challenges and the possibilities that are outlined in the guidebook about not just AI, but other technology that can help do that. But that exchange needs to be constant. It needs to be real. The good news is, as we all know, journalists are naturally skeptical and have an even healthier skepticism of us. And so my message would be, continue to be that skeptical community that challenges us, holds us accountable, but is also, out working in the field with us to try to understand. Another project we're working on that I think shows that is something called the Media Viability Accelerator, a partnership between us, Internews, and USAID for sort of worldwide engagement to use data, to use AI analytics to really understand the economics behind newsrooms across the world, and some practices and solutions that could take place to bolster and create more stability, better reach, and better engagement. Because what we all recognize, certainly this room more so than anybody, is that the loss of local journalism, of local news across the world, results in less accountability, less responsibility, and less community engagement, and a less healthy democracies across the world. And so that's, for us, that constant feedback loop is critical. It's why we're here. It's why we're having the breakfast tomorrow, to have that same conversation. But it's right to hold us accountable and not just trust us.
Is it a hot breakfast?
Sure, I'll be making omelets.
I think I would add, you mentioned community engagement, and I think that, on the trust topic, we have audience. We know people are using, but just talk about Microsoft, given that that's what you mentioned and that's what we have expertise on. People are using Microsoft products, Microsoft services, and the question is why? Do they trust it, or is that their only choice? And how can we engage with people? How can we engage with people to understand what is working, what is not working, and start creating kind of that feedback loop that you're talking about, not just at a one-to-one omelet making kind of scale, but like scale that out to really understand and bring the feedback into the services and the products so we can sort of strengthen that at every turn. And I think that's the responsibility that we know we have, and that can sort of create this bridge between not only users and consumers and humans and these bigger tech companies, but also maybe between journalists and tech organizations as well.
I think, incremental trust building is really important. You're saying, we've been burnt before, and that's understandable. And so I think through these like incremental exercises of, meeting and convening in the same way that we do here and elsewhere, and that kind of leading to some of those governance pieces that Matt talked about, but also, real results. I think that kind of builds trust. And I think I would challenge everyone to think of the opposite of that. Like, if we don't work together, what options do we have other than that? And so that is like one of the things that we really believe in Partnership on AI, is the power of convening, the power of bringing people together to find collective solutions by bringing, tech companies around the table, civil society, journalists, academics, and we have sometimes difficult but thoughtful conversations around what some of the solutions might look like. And not everyone is going to see eye to eye all the time, but at least we are talking about real steps that we can collectively take. And so that is part and parcel of the work that I do and others do at Partnership on AI, and a lot of it ends up being guidance that is co-developed by everyone. And so everyone gets an opportunity to see themselves in the work that we do and buy into that process. And it often means that we start very small, but that means that what we do does build that trust over time.
And for Liz and Matt, what does building trust look like with journalism community for you, for Microsoft?
Yeah, so happy to answer that, and I'll use an example from sort of my prior life. The socks I'm wearing say Trusted Info 2020. That was a campaign with election officials that I worked on when I was in government to provide information, trusted information from election officials to the communities about the security of elections. Those socks, if you would have asked me, I promise I'm answering. If you would have asked me in 2018 when I started working with election officials from the federal level to the state level, whether we could get to the point where we were co-branding socks together, a real goal, I would have said no. We were literally being accused of trying to hack them, subvert elections, things like that. The only way the trust was gained was not only meeting them out in the community, traveling to all the states, engaging, but being responsive. I think that the feedback will only continue to come if there's a response loop to show, yes, we've implemented, yes, we've heard you, or no, we can't do that, and here's why from a design standpoint or otherwise. And so to me, the trust is being out and supporting those pilots, supporting projects like the Media Viability Accelerator with the journalism community, being at events like this, and being open and willing and empathetic to the prior experience that you mentioned, right? And the need to be responsive in the feedback loop, not just show up, listen, sponsor a conference. And so for me, that trust is built on that constant feedback of trust and recognizing that the skepticism is real and well-founded, and that validating that trust is a constant exercise, not one that you can just do once and kind of walk away from.
Yeah, and I just add that the same approaches that might be helpful in your organizations that help you communicate between the newsroom and your product group. So if there is a divide, and I'm sure there is not, between the newsroom and product. But if there is, and there has
No,
been,
never.
Just-
Silos in newsrooms?
Never. I know, but just for example, if there might be, and things have worked for you. So, for example, something that had worked previously in projects that we had done was we realized that we were all focused on the same goal. We're all focused on audience. We all have the same goal of understanding. We're all pushing toward the same thing. So, sort of having the same language, having the same goal. We all realized that we all interview, some of it to sort of rustle up product insights and user insights, and some to actually conduct interviews that would go on air or in print. So if you can sort of take that, as Dalia and I were describing earlier in a conversation, the kind of like that microcosm, and sort of bring it out to the macrocosm of tech companies or larger companies and journalistic organizations, those same strategies probably apply in creating those bridges and those partnerships.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason why I bring up trust as being really delicate, because, you know, in many different journalism conferences or in some of the narrative, there is a very legitimate fear that AI going to replace journalists, right? And so how much of that is actually legitimate? Or is there actually a more nuanced perspective on how AI going to impact the day-to-day work that we do?
I think there definitely is a lot of nuance there. I think in a lot of ways, the AI that we see being used in newsrooms now is being used to support a lot of the mundane work that journalists would rather not do. And so it is, in a lot of ways, playing a support capacity, or should be playing a support capacity, let me say. But if we're being kind of honest with ourselves, and we look in a lot more of the mid to like long term, is it going to change the nature of how journalists do their work? I think so. But I think it is also a vote of confidence for good journalism. Like, I think the way that we think of how AI can play a role in supporting data journalism, or in supporting in-depth research, or in supporting long-form journalism, I think that's kind of where the trend is going to be heading. And I think that a lot of the, you know, mundane, repetitive work that journalists might not necessarily want to do is what is going to get crowded out by a lot of these AI technologies. And I think we already see it in a lot of ways. There's, you know, a lot of support for like long form podcasting. There's a lot of support for like long form YouTube videos or content in general. And so I think that, you know, high quality investigative journalism is going to become that much more worthwhile.
I completely agree. I mean, I think the fears, the concerns are legitimate and need to be discussed, are real. But there's also these opportunities, particularly in under-resourced, under-supported newsrooms across the globe, these opportunities, not just for the mundane tasks, I think that's right, but to be able to really dig into data, sustainability, you know, items that would allow newsrooms to find additional partners, to increase their reach, increase their sustainable investment, and to empower journalists to go do what they do. What we believe at Microsoft, and talking with journalists and know from engaging, is that AI can't develop sources. AI can't create that human touch to build out reporting, and to have the networks, and to connect with communities, and to engage in a very human, empathetic way with the stories that you all produce. But what AI can do is help bring about those stories and create really powerful data visualization that's very targeted within your community to tell the story that you're going to tell in your very human, connected way that AI can't in that way. And so you can't replace the ability of a good journalist to really go out and develop those sources, those leads, and tell a really compelling story. But it certainly can help support that in a variety of ways, including, once that story is done, you know, can we turn it into a newsletter or video content or something for social in a very efficient way, so that the reporter can continue to do what they do really well while that story is reaching the community in new, really important ways.
Yeah, so you know, when we think about the journalists, sometimes we say the media, they're more than just people who sort of report stories, right? So, you know, there's, you know, video editors, photographers, designers, data analysts. You know, what are some of the new skills you think that every sort of different journalists need to have to actually stay relevant? You know, like where's the conversation around that? Is sort of like whether it's inside Microsoft or through partnership. It's like how is their job actually fundamentally going to change in the next 3 years? Or even the next 12 months?
Yeah, good question. I think we touched on prompt engineering earlier, or I may have touched on it earlier. We're thinking a lot about that, just with on the design side. So in creating kind of like visual assets and visual processes. So I think the same is true for content. So we've been looking at that as well. And so I think creating new kinds of roles around prompt engineering and having people who are then sort of prompt engineer directors to a certain degree. So they're in sort of a position of sort of shepherding and guiding as well, and then helping others on the team learn and kind of educating the team. So doing as much as one can to sort of try to help a team understand how to sort of push down the prompt engineering processes into the work. So that could mean generative AI image creation and using that throughout the design processes, something that we're experimenting with very, very much so. Using that to kind of create copy and UX writing that kind of populates your interfaces, and like having these kinds of roles be sort of standard roles on the team is something that we're looking at on the user experience and design side. What would you?
I think there needs to be like a level of, or a base level of understanding of how AI works. And I think a lot of the times we think of AI as like this like one big thing that is fairly similar across the board. But AI in a lot of ways is a catch-all term for a very diverse set of technologies and how they operate. And so if we're asking the consumer or the person on the receiving end to be able to discern how AI plays a factor in the information that they're receiving, I think we can also ask from ourselves and others in this industry to have that like understanding of how the technology works, because once we understand it and once we kind of take away this almost mysticism around how the technology works, we're able to apply some of those pieces of ethical approaches, governance, all of those, and be able to make some of those decisions about the technology in a way that's a lot better informed, and in a way that empowers the journalists to be able to kind of ask the right questions from tech companies, from developers, and really interrogate the technology that's being sold to them beyond just the very obvious opportunities that it presents. And so I think that understanding of the technology and how it works is fairly accessible. It is not difficult to understand at a basic level how AI operates, but I think we're, or at least for myself, let me talk about myself. I think for me, when I was first approaching that field, I was like, but it's technology, and I'm not a computer scientist, and I'm not a developer, and I have never worked in any of those capacities, so how could I possibly understand something that I can't develop myself? But I think the more I dug into it, I was like, no, like this is conceptually easy to understand. I can draw a lot of parallels to things that I've learned previously, and I can bring my own background and nuance to that field in a way that maybe a computer scientist or someone who is exclusively in the technology field might not. And so I kind of would encourage journalists to do the same.
So true or false in this statement, while AI won't replace journalists, AI will replace journalists who doesn't use AI. In the next, I'll caveat in the next 5 years, maybe, not immediately.
We say it at the same time.
Yeah, we could. 1, 2, 3.
True. True.
I'm going to say false.
Oh.
I want to go with maybe. I mean, look, I think.
Well, the reason I'm asking
Yeah.
is,
I love
want
true false questions.
The reason I'm asking is basically I want to get a sense for all the decision makers out there and journalists, like what is it that we need to double down on
Yeah.
right now
Yeah.
for our news organization, for our individual job? What is it that we need to double down on AI so that we could stay relevant?
Experimentation, number one. Number two, experimentation. Number three, experimentation. And I mean, I think that's it. The tools right now are free. The bar is low, and companies all around are open to support and help. Everyone is learning. So we're in this mode of experimentation and learning. So I think the top three things that we can do are to try things, experiment, take the biggest risk one can, because the learning will be great and the failure will be tiny. That's sort of, I mean, those are broad strokes without any business model attached, but that I think could have the greatest return, and that takes people who can help educate. That takes lots of things sort of internally, but that would be where I think people should double down.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I was hung up on the journalists that use AI. Certainly journalists that experiment with or try or advance their understanding of AI is going to be critical moving forward. And then, doubling down on transparency about your own policies, your own approach. The only way to write about those things and be transparent about it is to try it, to experiment, to understand how it might impact your work, the work of the newsroom, and then to reevaluate, what are the policies we need, how can we be transparent about it, and then to go out and be who you naturally are, which is curious, skeptical, challenging both the technology, the companies, and the way that you think about using it within your own operation, whether that's on the business side, the actual reporting side, the data side, right? There's so many opportunities where data can be used to tell a larger story and then a very targeted story within communities, but you can only discover that by going out and trying the tools and seeing what works within the operation that you have to work within. And so I think doubling down on that transparency about the use of it, about how you approach it, and then the policies and having those in place and being very open about it is going to be really critical when we talk about trust.
Yeah. And Dalia, for policies, I know you've been working a lot. Part of the partnership is looking at some ethical concerns. Is like, what are some of as journalists are experimenting and adopting AI, what do you think some of the ethical considerations are in utilizing this tool? Like, how do we, in terms of bias, accuracy, and maintaining the integrity of news, like, what have you learned from your work?
I think we've learned quite a bit. So over the last year or so, we've been working with a lot of various partners and folks within the journalism community more broadly, whether it was tech companies or journalists or local news organizations or academics or civil society. All of those kind of different approaches to journalism or kind of different actors in that field to start and tackle that question. And I think where we landed was on the question of procurement and like which tools are we choosing to employ in newsrooms. And so that was kind of a lot of the questions that we were hearing from journalists. And so we started working on a guidebook that really supports the responsible, not just procurement, but also adoption and use of AI in newsrooms. And a lot of that has been powered by the input that we've gotten from the community itself. And it goes step by step through that entire process to kind of push newsrooms to ask the right questions as they're going through that process. Whether it's asking the right questions within your newsroom first to interrogate why you need the tool that you need, or asking the right questions from the developers, or putting in place the right governance to Matt's point, and the right policies in place. And so to answer your question, I think some of the biggest ethical concerns come in when we're talking about how we're communicating to our audiences, how we're using all of these various technologies and how it's impacting them. And I think that is kind of one of the biggest considerations that newsrooms really need to think about. How are they telling their audiences how they're using some of these technologies? And then how are they considering the data and the information that has gone into developing some of that tech and how it's impacting the results that they're seeing? Because if a lot of the data and a lot of the information that has gone in is of a particular worldview, is biased in any way, then a lot of the decisions that that technology will then make will reflect those biases, you know? And we see it sometimes, and we see the anecdotes of like, oh, like X generative AI platform, you know, only assumes that like white men can be in leadership positions. And that one is obvious, right? But then, you know, there's a lot more of those implications in how a tool might help you write a story, or how a tool might tell you, you know, to consult certain sources, or how a tool might, you know, use the data even being provided by some of your audiences to then suggest further stories to them or prioritize certain stories. And then if we want to go like a level deeper, then how are some of these AI tools collecting data about your audiences? You know, where we're employing a lot of these tools, we're giving them access to our databases or to our audience's data. How is that data then being reused by that tool? Are they selling it to someone else? Are they collecting that personal information for other uses? And I think all of these are real questions that we really need to kind of wrestle with.
Has the tech company themselves asked themselves these questions? And if they do, what are the answers? Are they sharing it with, I mean, because I think as the journalism community is asking the same question, it will be beneficial for us to know how did you guys, when I say you guys, tech company, or tech partners are answering those questions.
Yep.
Yeah, I bet, you know, so part of my team does two different things. One is work on something called Bing Chat, which is the sort of AI chatbot, and the other thing is Microsoft's Start newsfeed, the worldwide news platform. The Bing Chat product is new, and so over the course of its development since last year, we've been trying to sort of publish and put out on our blog and in every sort of public forum that we can, everything that we've been learning. And that's from, you know, both the sort of like the way that we've been grounding the data to the RAI, the responsible AI principles and guidelines that we've been using and developing so that other people can use them too, you know, user research and what we've been doing to learn how to feed that feedback back into the platform. So I think that that's one way that we're sharing what we're developing, but it's likely, and I'll just say not enough, and it would be great to understand what else, you know, where else can we be? Forums like this are great, but not scalable, although, hello, YouTube. You know, and I think like what, you know, guidebooks are great as well, but so yes, in limited ways to people who know to look for them, but I think the real challenge is how do you get that information to people who don't know to look for it, because those are probably the communities who need it the most.
Yeah.
That's my...
Agree completely. The Microsoft has tried, I think, hard to be very transparent about approach, about thought, about where shortcomings may exist, the AI principles of fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency and accountability, but then weaving those in with also a blueprint for how to govern AI, right? So publishing that and talking about some approaches that could put some safety brakes on the technology to create better relationships with researchers and more transparency there. So weaving that in, and then commitments to government, right? Being part of the European Union Code of Practice and the DSA and living up to those commitments, being transparent with our data in the reporting within those, and then seeing that reflected in the product. So the Bing Chat example, Bing Chat is not OpenAI, right? Bing Chat uses OpenAI, but then has search underlying it. Liz can talk more intelligently about this, but one of the things that Bing Chat offers is sourcing on results when you get a chat. So it gives footnotes and references to where the information comes from that offers more transparency because search is underlying that, and use of NewsGuard data so that you can evaluate whether or not information is coming from authoritative sources or not in the results in those citations. Continuing to double down on that trustworthiness indicators not only, I think, helps support this community and links back to the information and reporting that's going on, but also gives the users something to interact with, to understand, what am I looking at? Where is this coming from, in a way that's really important. So I think you'll continue to see this investment in those kind of trustworthiness indications as we struggle to meaningfully meet each one of these principles that we've committed to.
Yeah, you guys both talk about, responsible AI and being inclusive. As AI become more integral, how do we make sure that it actually it is more diverse and representation of voices, right? Because I feel like time and time again, we see how AI botch communities of colors, people of color in particular. What is it going to be different? How is it going to be different this time?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question, and it's probably one of the most important things that we can keep top of mind and ensure that we all have practices. I said that the top 3 things that we should be doing is experiment, experiment, experiment. That's not without careful planning about the potential sort of promise and peril of bias in AI. So we want to ensure that the systems that we create don't sort of reflect the biases that we all have. And so the REI practices that we have already published are sort of open and available to the public. And so I would say that one of the ways that we can ensure is, trying to, make them sort of accessible to as many people as possible, and continuing to just ensure that whatever we learn, we being the people who are creating those sort of guidelines and practices, are available to whoever is sort of on the creator side of these new technologies. But there's only so much one can do at the intersection of sort of experimentation and governance. But I think that it is equally as important as sort of moving at the speed of innovation is sort of moving at the speed of responsible AI. And like one can't move faster than the other, although responsible AI might be first. But I think keeping them sort of in parity is really important.
I think the journalistic application of AI is very interesting because newsrooms were a bit slower to adopt AI than other industries. And so it gives us a very unique opportunity that might not be presented in other industries for intentionality. And so knowing what we know about AI and its impact, knowing what we know about how it primarily tends to impact our level of diversity, what voices are included in the room, who is being heard, who is advantaged in a situation of technological adoption, like large newsrooms versus smaller newsrooms, kind of considering all of those layers, how can then we be very intentional about how we apply some of these technologies? It is not enough to just know that they have that impact. It is even more important to say, okay, how do we, knowing what we know, then go in eyes wide open into how we adopt it, look around the room, make sure that, there's diverse voices being represented in using the technology, but also diverse voices being represented in who is informing how that technology is being created. What data is being collected about whom, right? And so being intentional at all of those stages is really important. Being intentional in the physical rooms that we're in, similar to here at ONA, or similar to like the Knight Foundation and the work that they do when they fund, is really important because that kind of reflects some of those ethos of knowing what we know, how can we impact the fields that we're in.
Do we have an audience question?
Yes, we can do a couple of quick questions. There are two that were submitted by Vivek and by Mike, a WordPress consultant and Intercept person, respectively. And they both relate to the input that's coming from the journalism community into a lot of the LLMs. And the question is, how much should we be thinking about and cautious about data governance around these issues? Micah's example was if you're putting sensitive data in from investigative reporting, for instance, to use the power of AI to investigate a data set, but it's sensitive material that's getting kind of fed into that. So how should newsrooms be thinking about this?
It's a good question. I think we are, what I would say that one of the important things about the way that we're approaching our, speaking from the Bing side, is that we're pairing AI with a search index so that we can ensure accuracy. And so I think in ways that you can sort of ground the AI, if at all possible, and not just rely on AI itself and sort of ground it in data that's coming from another source. Or if you're not able to do that, to point to the fact that you're not doing that and inform the audience at every turn what is happening. I think that might be an approach. I think that we're very self-aware of like when a particular data set is outdated, where we're not good. We're not good at sports, for example, and just sort of like how do we make sure that people who are on the receiving end of that are sort of informed about what they're seeing at every turn.
Yeah, I think there's also a question about privacy that, like, if you're adding data into a system, do you run the risk of that just being widely available? I think there have been several, examples of this that we kind of heard about over the past few years. So, like, how should a newsroom be thinking about that if they're the sort of originators of the data set, or they have one that was maybe given to them from a source?
Yeah, it's sort of like when we put the input on you, isn't the generative AI taking all of our collective IP to benefit the generative AI, but very little return back to the journalism community who's doing the inputting?
So yeah, I heard two kind of separate issues, but to try to. So just this is where the policies approach understanding the nature of the data, the sensitivity of the data. There are obviously options that we offer, others offer to have and use AI in a secure, private way, right? That is available to reporters and others. Part of our core principles are privacy and security around data security, but that's only as good as the policies of the user that has the data, that's inputting the data, and what they're opting into from a security standpoint. And so I think really understanding how sensitive the data is, what policies need to exist around that, and erring on the side of either understanding like what your options are or caution on using or exposing that data is critical. But that's a practice journalists already have, right? Really tight protection of that data. It's being equally sensitive to that, knowing that you have some secure, private AI options to you, but is that risk worth it to you in your sort of policy approach?
So I want to be mindful of time. So to wrap up, a quick answer is, what is your advice for everyone in this room? What is it they could do in the next 90 days to actually be better and be more familiar with AI and how they could use that as their day-to-day work? Any tips?
I would say, first of all, start small. Start with, to Liz's point earlier, experiment. That's really important. Learn more about the technology. I think that's important as well. And to kind of throw it back to earlier in the conversation, start by automating things that are repetitive, things that are, not super interesting for journalists to do, before you kind of go to like the more marketed technologies out there, the technologies that are, more bright and sparkly. But I think automating the mundane is a really great place to start, and then working your way out from there. I think also learning from other maybe larger newsrooms that have implemented some AI, a lot of them have been fairly transparent about what tools they've been using and how and what the results have been. So there's no need to kind of reinvent the wheel. I think there's a lot out there on use cases as far as what other newsrooms might have done and to learn from that.
Yeah, I'd say as a place to start, I agree with the start small. Try to take a moment and imagine the thing that takes you the longest amount of time for the least return in your personal life or your professional life. Like, what just takes you a really long time? And then turn to your tool of choice and see if the tool of choice might be able to assist in unlocking or solving that thing. For me, on a professional note, I love to use tool of choice for, I won't name any names, to summarize and compare gigantic PDF documents and just look at that side by side. And that, to me, frees up a lot of time to allow me to do more strategic synthesis. And I find that pretty magical, and it saves me some time. On a personal note, I recently was in a moment of purchasing a car, and I loved to ask, will these three things, this dog, this bicycle, and this size and age of child, fit into these types of vehicles? And list the vehicles and get a comparative chart, and saving lots and lots of time. So just on a personal or professional note, try to sort of evaluate what is it that you spend a lot of time on that you really doesn't bring you a lot of value, and use the tool to kind of investigate that.
Mine's come have breakfast with me tomorrow morning and continue this
Yes,
discussion.
you will be
That's
making
mine.
omelet, I heard.
Yeah.
So basically, to wrap up is experiment with caution. So with that, thank you so much for the conversation this morning, and hope everyone will have a great rest of the day in conference.